Are you increasing the value of the property when you do your fit out? We often hear a tenant saying, can I get a lower rent because I'm increasing the value? Let's talk through it this morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Morning Minutes, episode 362, I believe, 63, 62-ish, something like that. It's getting up there, 62. This morning, we're talking about the myth of, if you're a tenant, are you actually increasing the value of the property? We often hear when we're showing a property, negotiating a lease deal, often the tenant would say, can I get an extra month or two free rent? Can I get a lower annual rent because I'm doing all this to the property and adding value? Now, the big question is, what is sort of is that true? And is there more to it? Like, is there a difference of is it adding value to the actual property, or is it just having a good fit out for yourself? James, what sort of, you're negotiating a lot of lease deals at the moment, what's sort of in the tenant's view? And then let's sort of work through what their perception of adding value is. And is it really?
Yeah. So whatever kind of business you're starting, you might be doing a fit out that's going to be beneficial for yourself. But the tenants are then coming into this mindset where they're assuming because they're spending 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, that value was then pushed onto the owner. But the reality of that is that it doesn't actually make a difference whatsoever for the owner. We were talking before, it's your lease terms. It's not what's in the pre-existing fit out or what's in the fit out that's going to make any difference. So there's a little cloud that surrounds this. Because it's not useful necessarily for the next business that comes through. It could be a long lease or a short lease, but it could be a totally different business that's coming in next time. And if you spend 50K on an office fit out and then you've got a cafe coming into the property, it makes no difference, because at the end of the day, the end of the lease, just like with any make good clause, it's going to be ripped out and it's going to be taken back to where it was before. So it makes no difference to the owner at the end of the day.
And that's key, and that's what a lot of people don't necessarily think of, or they use it as a negotiation point, that they're spending 50 grand. It's basically all the owner's benefit. But you got to remember that fit out is for them to operate their business, make their money. It's really all the values to them. Now, there are some things a tenant does which does increase the potential value or the rentability for the owner. But a lot of the time, that's more infrastructural. So I think I made up another word. So basically, it would be a retail shop if it doesn't have a grease trap or an exhaust system. Now, if the tenant goes to the trouble of having that installed, because James, you and I both know a shop with a grease trap and exhaust, it can rent faster and rent for a higher price with the right tenant than a shop without it. So if you do have a tenant going in there, putting that into the property, then there is sometimes a value add. And quite often, James, we do have an owner, when they notice that, they will help. I've had many times whenever a tenant's done that, the owner has contributed half, because the owner does see the long-term benefit of that property. But I've also had times where a cafe's gone in who's done that investment, but the next tenant was an office tenant, and they used none of it. But the owner thinks, well, over 30 years, if the average tenant stays 3 years, I'm going to have 10 tenants. More often than not, maybe a tenant will be able to pay me more rent because it has that facility, or it will rent quicker, compared to if the tenant goes in there and puts new carpet down, repaints it, does a lot of that, I want to say cosmetic. You could sort of look at the infrastructure changes, plumbing, grease trap, exhaust. The cosmetic changes could be like your painting, your carpet, even petitioning. How often do you hear, James, they're like, I'm putting up all this petitioning, but that's built for exactly how they would like it. a key thing is for any tenant going in, if you sort of delete that mindset, you're adding any value to the owner, and just think to yourself, you need a lease long enough for you to get your money back for that fit out. So cafe is a good example. If you're doing a 50 grand fit out and you're only got a 6-month lease, then you unless you had an extraordinary business, it's not long enough to make money to pay yourself, let alone that fit out. Where that's where it's very, because James, when we see cafe tenants, they generally want a longer lease than a retailer because they're not investing as much into it.
Yeah, they want that sort of tenure in the property, and especially if they are going to do that fit out, so that the investment that they can make, they can return that and then some. And it's not going to make much sense if they're in for a short time and they're putting this money in. It's not just value added to the owner when they resell the property. If they add a grease trap, if they add an exhaust system or a range hood or all that, and that stays, does that add any value to the property itself on dollar value, Michael?
You can't really quantify it, if that makes sense, and there is no dollar increase until you have a lease in place. Now, a lot of commercial property is valued by the tenancy. So if I have 2 retail shops, one's empty with a grease trap and one's leased, if that's rented at a good rental rate, that will sell more than the one with the grease trap. So where an owner would increase the value by having a grease trap is either just having a tenant simply at the right rent, or if you've got 2 identical shops with one with the grease trap, one without, and one's rented at $500 a week and the other one's rented at $525 a week because they were able to use the grease trap compared to the other one, then that can increase the value. But it's all case by case. And the thing that sort of contradicts what sometimes tenants think, they go, well, I'm adding a great fit out, I've increased the value, I want $1,000 a year off the rent. But if the owner goes to sell, a buyer's value is not what's the fit out, it's the lease, what you touched on earlier. So if they work on a yield on a property with $29,000 a year, let's say, what's that, 29,000 at 5%. So let's say the rent was going to be 30 grand, but because they're doing a beautiful fit out, gold taps, it's amazing. The owner does $1,000 less a year because it looks good. So it would be worth 580,000. But let's say the owner didn't offer any lower rent because he sort of said, well, the value is the rent, not your beautiful fit out. And let's say the tenant spent half the amount on the fit out, but paid $30,000 a year. That's worth $600,000 to sell, where the other one's worth 580. So actually, by the tenant saying they're adding value, they're actually decreasing the value of the property. So, and that's key just to work on with when you're negotiating lease deals and the value. Because James, tenants, they really look at that annual rent and they say it adds value, but not necessarily the yield or prospective yield working there. What's where can we go now? Anything else you want to add on to that?
What I was just thinking was how you mentioned about, let's say, for example, an owner holds their commercial property for 30 years, and here's a good example. They might have 10 different tenants, 10 different tenants who might stay there for 3 years. If you do have some of these things, like if you do have a grease trap, it might add a little bit of value for the tenant moving in, so it can make your property more desirable from a tenancy perspective. So it's easier to lease, it's easier to return high rent. So it's not capital value in terms of what the property is worth, but it's the incentive as to why that's a good spot for people to move into. So there could be that tenant number 1, year 1 to year 3, does put a grease trap in, the owner goes halfway, it's not affecting the value, all of that makes no difference, but in the future it's easier to find tenants to get a better return, to have stronger leases, which makes property more valuable. So I think that's a good little point to make, and not necessarily going to be a relevant land point for a landlord, but it's worth thinking about for the long term, as most people will buy property to hold it. But I suppose it's the perspective of the landlord. Some are in and out, and some are keeping it for the long term.
It's a good point, and it's what we can tell the owner, where you may accept a tenant with a lower rent because they're going to have a grease trap, and it won't add the value, but it will potentially give you shorter lease times, because a retail shop with no grease trap may take 9 months to rent, and in our experience with the grease trap, it takes 3 to 4 months. So there's that sort of value there, but we're seeing sometimes properties with grease traps stay empty for a year. So it's all case by case, and the key for any tenant, just do the figures that make it work for you. Make sure you make your money. You don't want to overcapitalize, as Luke says on the fit out. But I think that's a good topic to cover, because we hear it all the time from tenants. We're adding value, adding value, but you've got to really look at it. Are you or are you not? And the key was cosmetic changes versus infrastructure changes to a property. But I think that's a wrap for this morning.
Cool. Good
Thanks,
work.
Jack.
Thanks, man. See you later.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.